So we can see that a theology of work really helps us to explore God's goodness as it's revealed in our purpose, in our work, in our lives, in so many different ways. Even as we seek out deeper relationships and significance in what we do and how we do it, that when we see these things and we see images inside of us, we see the way we desire to do these, that we recognize God placed that there. And for us to experience God's goodness and God's blessing and how He designed us, that we do approach work differently. It's interesting that God has created us in a way that we have to depend upon each other. Let me just share an example of what it might look like even in the garden. So let's say that Adam and Eve, and this is a joke that some of you have probably heard as I presented this before. Adam and Eve were Chinese, and as Chinese they decided to ignore the fruit and eat the snake. At the end of that, there is no moral sin. And somebody decided pretty quickly to put a wall around the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and now there's 7 billion people on this earth, and there is no moral sin. Now, in that setting, there still would be mistakes, because even though we don't have moral sin, we're finite. Meaning that if you look at who would have a job in the garden, if the garden had continued now into cities, but no moral sin, well, first of all, the police would probably not have a job. There would be no job for policemen because nobody was committing crimes. But there would be a job for firemen because people are still making mistakes and perhaps creating fires. And then the question would ask is, how would we steward this earth? Well, let's say that there's 3 of us, and let's say my gift from God was a sower of rice. And another person's gift from God was a grower of rice. And another person's gift from God was a harvester of rice. And we understood that that's what God had made us. We delight in doing that. That's our joy. That's our gifts. And perhaps even our names would be that. Sower of rice, harvester of rice. And yet there's no weeds. And so we would grow a lot of rice. And I have a grandmother who used to do a lot of zucchini and a lot of tomatoes. And every time we come to our house, we just have all these bags of zucchini and tomatoes. And we'd be kind of like that. We'd have all this rice and be tired of it and be wanting to perhaps have something else. But yet we look next to us and there's 3 people, sower of wheat, grower of wheat, harvester of wheat. And so as we looked at them, we would say, we have organized our gifts together to produce rice, and you have organized your gifts together to produce wheat. We don't have the gifts to produce wheat, but we can produce rice. What if we traded some of our rice for some of your wheat? Well, if you think about that, organizing gifts to accomplish something of value, and then with that, to trade that for somebody else who would produce something of value, what would you call that? Well, I think a lot of times you would call that business. And so in some ways, and this is another exaggeration, perhaps a joke, is that if you looked at the garden and we had never eaten the tree of knowledge of good and evil, that if you were in business, you would have a job. If you were a pastor, you probably wouldn't have a job in the garden. If you had a choice, if other people had a choice to say, I'd like to walk in the cool of the evening and talk to God Himself, or I could hear you talk about God, I think I would choose the first. Now again, a joke, but it shows you a little bit about the purpose of how we're made. And I'm assuming in the garden there would be storytellers, there'd be poets, there'd be all types of different gifts that now caretakers, people that are comforters and exhorters, all kinds of things that pastors do. But in terms of the formal role, they'd probably be very different, of course. And so we look at that, and even in the nature of even in the garden, there would be a sense that there are people that have needs, and there's people that have resources. And so if we were in the garden, you'd recognize that in some parts of the world, just because of the weather, they grow wheat. Other parts of the world, they grow rubber. And that would have to be exchanged, and probably we would have a currency, some kind of money, that would allow that exchange to be more efficient and more effective. And so there would be a sense in which there would be a need for people to go out and seek resources they don't have and be dependent upon other people for those resources. And there would be a need, because we're in the garden, we delight in doing what God asks us to do. God, being made in the image of God, God is a giver beyond our imaginations. And so each of us would be a giver. And so there would be a need in the garden for people to create things that people could give to. And so what you recognize is the whole idea of fundraising and dependency upon other people, both for avenues to receive money and avenues to give money, is actually part of God's design. Fundraisers would have a role in the garden. Givers would have a role in the garden. It'd be different. But essentially what we're asked to do as fundraisers and as givers is something that God designed. He created us to be dependent upon Him. He created us to be dependent upon each other. He created us to enjoy giving. He created us to enjoy receiving. And so when you think about the task of fundraising, what you're doing is a garden task, very natural to what it means to be made in the image of God. I want to talk about just some general biblical principles. First of all, if we're made to be stewards of this earth, some of the things that we are asked to steward involve money, power, and human sexuality. These are difficult things to steward, and often because we're perhaps scared of stewarding these things, we try to avoid them. There's various approaches to this. And first of all, I think often when I ask people, what is the root of all evil? The answer that I get is money. And yet that's really not what the passage says. 1 Timothy 6:10 says, it is the love of money that is the root of all evil. Same thing when we get to 1 John 2, verse number 15. Do not love the world or anything in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in them. Now notice that a lot of times when people say don't love the world, they say don't love money, power, and human sexuality. But actually this passage defines the world something different than that. It says, for everything in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. Notice these are obsessions with power, money, and human sexuality. It's not the actual thing, it's the obsession with them, the lust for them. It comes not from the Father, but from the world. The world and its desires pass away, but whoever does the will of God lives forever. We talk about that often when we see things like money, power, and human sexuality, we don't talk about them because we're afraid that in talking about them that we would somehow become obsessed. And of course, that is a danger. But yet when we're afraid of something and we're afraid of the giver of something, that God has a word for us. We see this in Matthew 25 in the parable of the talents. There's 3 servants, and the king goes away and gives them talents. And 2 of the servants say, what would the king desire me to do? Notice they're stewards. And they're asking, what would the king want me to do? Because it's not my money, it's his money. And 2 of them invest the money. When the king comes back, he sees that the money's been invested and a return has been made. And he says, well done, good and faithful servant. Let's say that they had invested the money and there was an economic downturn and they had lost the money. I still think the king would have said, well done, good and faithful servant, because they did what the king desired. And I think even more so, because we see this in the 3rd talent, the 3rd servant, that the king would have said, you did what I desired. You trusted my character and my goodness. You knew that I like to invest these talents. You knew that if you did it the way I did and lost it, that I would not hold you accountable for the loss. I would hold you accountable for stewarding it the way I desired. And so even if they lost it because of circumstances that neither the king nor the servants could have foretold, I think the king still would have said, well done, good and faithful servants. Here is some more talents for you to steward because you did it the way I desired. But notice the 3rd servant. He buried the money. And when the king said, why did you bury the money? His reply is, because I knew that you were a hard man. And notice what's happening there. He said, because I did not trust your character, I chose to do something with the money that was different than what you had desired me to do. I think the issue there is not the lack of interest. The issue is not the lack of return. The issue is not being a steward. And the reason he wasn't a steward is because he didn't trust the character of the king. I think that happens when we look at stewarding money. A lot of times we say, well, I don't want to have money because I'm afraid of what would happen. I become addicted to it. Or I don't want to have money because I'm afraid that people would criticize me for that. They would look down upon me because they would say that the money is the root of all evil, even though the passage says the love of money is the root of all evil. And so what happens is in our piety, in our statement of I want to pursue God, I want to do what God desires, we actually take what he asks us to steward, and because of our fear of it and our fear of God in ways that are non-trusting, we don't pursue it. And yet God says you need to steward the things I've given you, including those dangerous things, money, power, and human sexuality. And so what ends up happening is, as we walk away from that, saying that as a Christian, I cannot pursue money, then what I think God would say is, you don't trust the resource I've given you. You don't trust my goodness. You don't trust my empowerment. You don't trust the community of the church I've given you to help you be accountable as you face stewarding something that could obsess you. You don't trust my Holy Spirit, who has the power inside of you to guide you and to convict you and to have you to steward the money in a way that would actually allow you not to be obsessed by that. Because you chose to disobey me, you are a wicked and lazy servant. And so for many of us, we grew up in Christian environments where money was something we didn't talk about, or money was something that we didn't think Christians talked about. And so, for example, my grandfather, because of criticism from people in the church, when he bought my grandmother an Oldsmobile, and back then an Oldsmobile that had electric windows was a big deal, expensive, but he loved my grandmother and wanted to give her a special gift. But we never drove that car to church. It was actually parked in the garage and hidden when people came over to the house. People knew he had it, but he didn't want to flaunt it because he was afraid of the criticism of the fact that he had money and gave a good gift to the wife who he loved. And so the idea that we would avoid stewarding these things, which is essential to understanding a theology of fundraising. You can't avoid it. Money, if that's your call, is to raise resources. You can't avoid a discussion about stewardship of money if you're called to give money and be giving to other people. And so what ends up happening is, because of our attempts to be pious, our attempts to be pure, our attempts to avoid temptation, we end up actually being poor stewards. The other thing that happens, though, besides abdicating our role, some people would say, well, no, I'm not going to abdicate it, but I'm actually going to claim money, power, and human sexuality as something that I have a right to. And sometimes that's called prosperity gospel, an idea that that's something that we should claim, and we want to have money because God has the cattle on 1,000 hills, and He's given that to us. And a lot of abuses are taken because it's not that He's given that to us. He's asked us to steward those cattle, not to use them for our purposes and our enjoyment. As we see prosperity gospel where it's misused often, where people will fundraise, not saying give this to God's purposes and are held accountable for that and are discerning God's purposes. Instead, they're saying give it to me and often abusing money. And so what ends up happening is, instead of stewarding, they're trying to own it. Instead of using it for God's purposes, they're using it for their purposes. A third thing that people do sometimes with money that is not stewardship is they use it for strategic purposes but don't listen to how God sometimes may change it. They start off well. They say the strategic reason that God has given me this money and access to this money and influence is to accomplish these great things for God. But we often find that God is more interested in a person's heart than results. God can accomplish anything. He doesn't need us to do that, but He enjoys inviting us to be a part of that. So what happens is, I find over and over again when people have had success and accumulated money, and in the idea that they're going to use that money for God's purposes, often just at the time they're ready to invest that money, something will happen. They'll get sick, they'll have an economic downturn, something will happen in their business. And what ends up happening is God often will say, give that money to someone else. See this in the issue of David and Solomon, that David was asked to give what he accumulated for Solomon to build the temple. And often what happens, it's a test. Did you do this in order to have significance in your own mind for accomplishing something strategic? Or did you do this truly to discern the will of God and to accomplish the will of God? Perhaps we look at the Matthew 25 story of the talents. And what if the king came back and he said, I'd like to see my money? And then one of the servants said, I have invested the money in amazing investments. However, if you just keep the money in that investment for 2 more months, you're going to have even a better investment than what I can bring to you now. And as a matter of fact, I have actually gained a reputation of being very good at investing. And so I think that you should continue to give me the strategic ability to invest your money because I'm doing very good at it. If that conversation was happening with the king would say, you're in great danger of not understanding whose money it is. But if you notice, the good servants said, here is the money back. No questions asked, nothing about what they would do in their future. And the reward was more money to invest. And so I think one of the traps we have is thinking of it strategically in our way, but not asking for discernment from God, sometimes which doesn't make sense. And more often I've seen people just at the pinnacle of acquiring money for using for strategic purposes for God, that God has asked them or accomplished or did something that would ask them, is it really your money or is it God's money? And often when they obeyed and they said, I'm giving this money away for another purpose because I heard God say that, I'm recognizing that somebody else will have to build what I thought I would build, but to God be the glory. It's amazing sometimes when God said, I've tested my servant. He's brought Isaac up to the mountain. He's willing to sacrifice his son, his idol, what had become his meaning. And so because of that, I can trust him with even greater talents. And so 3 ways we don't steward money. We either avoid it and abdicate. And certainly in my country, in the United States, we've abdicated. And so what happens is when the church and Christians abdicate in stewarding money, Wall Street begins to steward money. And as not being Christians, they don't understand it. And so as a result of it, great harm has been done to our country and into the world because Christians have abdicated that role. In the area of power, we've abdicated that because we're afraid of it. Thought that we were following God by avoiding power. And yet now our secular Washington, D.C. stewards power in ways that, of course, the world would steward, not understanding it, addicted to it. And human sexuality, again, we don't talk about that in the church. And as a result, Hollywood has become the steward, in certainly our country, of what it means to be a male, to be a female, what human sexuality means. And they've stewarded it horribly and then exported that filth throughout the world. So what happens is when we abdicate, thinking that we're following God to remain pure, God would say to us, you're not trusting my character. You're not trusting the accountability of the community of the church, because it is dangerous to steward things that you could become obsessed with. But I still call you to do that because I am a good God. The Holy Spirit inside of you is to be depended upon. And the church is a source of accountability to keep you as good stewards. And so you're wicked and lazy servants. And as a result of that, the earth is cursed because other people have, in your abdication, have picked it up that didn't understand my purposes and never attempted to even pursue my purposes. The other place is when we try to claim it as our own. The prosperity gospel. Again, that is not a steward. The other wrong way of approaching it is when we see it for our strategic purposes, perhaps starting out as God's. But when God tests us and asks us to give that up, that we refuse to do so because our identity has been somehow caught up in accomplishing what we originally thought was God's will. Now it's become our will, even though God has said he changed really the direction he's called us to. So a steward of money, power, and human sexuality pursues it not as a source of their own identity, not as something that they own, but as something that they're listening to the owner, and they're listening to discern what God desires for them to use this money for.